سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا ومولانا محمد صلى الله تعالى عليه وسلم ورسوله النبي الأمين المكين الحنين الكريم الرؤوف الرحيم. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال الله تعالى في شأن حبيبه إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد كما تحب وترضى بأن تصلي عليه. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. فمن أظلم ممن كذب على الله وكذب بالصدق إذ جاءه أليس في جهنم مثوى للكافرين والذي جاء بالصدق وصدق به أولئك هم المتقون. صدق الله العظيم وبلغنا رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك من الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين. Most respected ulama, my respected elders, brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Globally, we're discussing the concept of leaders and leadership. Leaders and leadership are generally categorized in 5 general categories. In no particular order: religious or spiritual leaders, intellectual leaders, leaders in terms of academia and intelligentsia and so on. Then you get the financial and the economical leaders of the world, right? And you have political leaders, and last but not least, you have social leaders. So you have what we call religious or spiritual leadership. You'd have the economical leadership or financial leadership, you'd have the intellectual leadership, you'd have political leadership, and you have social leadership. And in each of these categories, throughout human history, people have excelled and people have exerted an influence that for many hundreds of years has never been forgotten. If we look at religious and spiritual leadership, in my opinion, I think that's the highest ranking position in terms of the impact that spiritual leaders have had in the course of history. All the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remembers and acknowledges in the Holy Quran, and other prophets that other religions have subscribed to, have been regarded as some of the most influential leaders in human history. So religious leadership and spiritual leadership is undoubtedly, if not the highest ranking position in terms of leadership, and the Anbiya alayhi salatu, the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, undoubtedly hold the highest rank in terms of spiritual leadership. Now, when it comes to political leadership as well, you see that there have been certain people and certain dynasties and empires that have been very, very influential leaders. And this leadership doesn't necessarily have to be positive. Sometimes political leadership, or very often, political leadership has been negative in terms of its impact, but it has changed the course of human history in one form or the other. Right? Just to give you negative leadership, you think about the Hitlers of the world, you think about the Fara'ina or the Fir'auns of the world, you think about all of these despots, right? Whether it was in the Muslim empires or other empires of the world, you see those people who have had a very negative impact, but they have changed the course of human history, either positively or negatively. And you've had obviously the positive political leaders who really changed the world and made the world a better place. You have financial and economic leadership. And in terms of that, some of the most common and some of the most popular ones that you and I will understand and who became icons in terms of their influence in the world of finance and economics, right? You would see popular CEOs like Steve Jobs, right? Who was an icon in terms of what he did to one company. Right? And how he brought a company up to the level that it is right now, which is the most profitable company, well, up until recently, in the world. Likewise, his counterpart, Bill Gates. Likewise, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and so many other financial leaders who have ruled the world. I'm just giving you the famous ones that people can identify with, as opposed to ones that we don't know. Okay? So these are the people who are in high positions of finance and economic leadership in the world. And they have Warren Buffett, not forgetting. Right? These people have inspired capitalism and inspired business in general. Then you have the very important category of what we know as social leadership. And in terms of social leadership, those people who work for the betterment of humanity, those who work for the upliftment of society, right? are regarded as the social leaders. You've had so many civil rights movements, Martin Luther King, and so many others, Malcolm X, right? And all these other leaders who worked for the upliftment and the betterment of society in one form or the other, whether it was fighting global climate change, whether it was fighting slavery, whether it was standing up against issues of rampant capitalism and working for the alleviation of poverty, etc., etc. You've had people of social leadership on all levels, and they've inspired people throughout history. Interestingly, in the Forbes magazine, right, recently they published categories, like I just mentioned, in terms of these various fundamental and general categories of leadership: political, social, intellectual, and economical and religious. Or I forgot intellectual. Intellectual, the famous ones are Noam Chomsky. You'll get our what's the guy's name? He just died now. Cerebral palsy. Hawkins, Stephen Hawking, right? And so many others. So just to give you an idea, Forbes magazine mentioned something very interesting. They gave a list of categories of all of these leaders and how they manifest. So in terms of social or intellectual leadership, you'd have the dean of a university, or the vice chair of a university, vice chancellor of a university. In terms of social interaction and so on, you'd possibly have a mayor of a town who's responsible for municipal requirements of the people or whatever it is. But the highest ranking social responsibility was that of being a parent. They said the most stressful position of leadership in terms of social leadership is the leadership of being a parent. So that you understand from this here what types of leadership there are, and in one form or the other, we have to be placed into, and we are placed into, a position of leadership. Therefore, the Prophet of Allah said, every one of you, right, is a shepherd. كلكم راع وكلكم مسؤول عن رعيته. Every one of you is a shepherd, and each one of you will be held accountable regarding his or her flock. So at one point or the other, we are expected to assume some type or some form of leadership position. Now, when it comes to Islam, and when it comes to the issues of management and leadership, there's very little literature out there, right, up until recently, regarding Quranic and prophetic directives with regards to effective management and leadership. And we tend to take our cues, and we tend to latch onto the trends that have been put forth by CEOs like Steve Jobs, like Bill Gates, like Elon Musk, like Jeff Bezos, who have become, and don't forget Zuckerberg, right? And all of these people, we take our cues from them in terms of what is effective management, what is effective leadership, Warren Buffett, and so on, right? Islam, however, unbeknown to us, if we haven't known, right, has a system and has presented us a practical system of management and leadership. If we were to draw lessons from those aspects of management and leadership as espoused by the greatest scholars of Islam, I think we will be able to use it and present an example for humanity that will teach us effective leadership on every level, whether it is political, whether it is economical, whether it is spiritual, whether it is intellectual, or whether it is social leadership. But I just want to discuss one aspect today, because I can't get into all of them at one point or the other. Because many of us are involved in the corporate sector, or we are involved in business, trade and commerce in one form or the other. I want to discuss one aspect of leadership, and that is what we call economic leadership, or leadership in the financial and the economic sectors. Nothing in particular, but I want to focus on that more than anything else. And it's almost, I didn't say it is, it's almost a follow-up of a discussion that I had given, or a discourse that I had given regarding amana, trust. Okay? But I had discussed trust. But what precedes amana is to be in a position of economic leadership. And in order for you to be in that position of economic leadership, you have to have what is called a C-level job. A C-level job is where is the highest ranking role in a corporate organization, right? And the person who holds a C-level position is regarded as the chief. And as a chief is either a COO, a chief operating officer, or he is a CFO, chief financial officer, or he is a chief executive officer. These are fundamentally the three C-level jobs that any corporation has. right? The CEO, Chief Operational Officer, is responsible basically for the day-to-day operations and whatever it is there, and often oversees the Human Resources Department, right? The strategic approach of effective and efficient management of people. So he's the COO. Then you have the CFO. Everybody knows that one. Everybody wants to be that. Chief Financial Officer, right? And of course you have the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer. So in order for you to fulfill the position of Amana, you also first have to have the position of C-level job. And I'm using the word C and I'm correlating the word Sidq. C-level job for us would be Sidq. So you have Sidq and Amana. And the Holy Prophet ﷺ was called As-Sadiq and Al-Amin. He's always referred to as As-Sadiq first and then Al-Amin. Because you have to be in a C-level position, and what we call Sidq level position, before you are worthy of being in an absolute position of Al-Amana. Now, when we look at the concept of a Chief Operating Officer who's responsible fundamentally, amongst other things, in terms of human resource management, and if you look at the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, right, and if you look at the CEO, who would be the case study that every person in a position of fiduciary responsibility should be using as a case study and should be emulating in Islam? If I were to appoint one person who would be more than qualified in terms of all of three positions, because he held all three positions, C-level positions, or what we call SID level positions of Chief Operating Officer, Chief Financial Officer, and Chief Executive Officer, the only person who stands out more than head and shoulders above everybody else in terms of that corporate responsibility is none other than Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Nobody parallels him in Islam with regards to the guidelines and the inspiration that he has given us in terms of sidq, which will then prepare us for the position of amana. Now, I don't want to go give you a historical narrative because I'm discussing here in terms of these corporate positions that we hold, and it's almost a follow-up of what amana is and how we can, we can practically apply amana with these qualifications of sidq. Now, let me go to human resources first. He was the Chief Operating Officer. What was his human resource vision? And what was his human resource philosophy? And why I say this is because people in position of trust, in people who are in position of trust, particularly when they are entrusted with the wealth of people, when they are entrusted with the savings of people, when they are entrusted with the lives of people, right, have to know and have to follow a certain type of human resource management policy. Whether it's on an individual level, whether it is on a corporate level, or whether it is on a social and a national and a global level. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu by far was one of the greatest human resource managers in the history of Islam. And he took it from the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. And the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, right? You remember one thing about Abu Bakr as-Siddiq? There are many sahabis who quoted numerous ahadiths. Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu was very careful regarding his narration of ahadith. So if you look at the books of hadith as well, right, very few ahadith, but I mean few, it's in hundreds and so on, but it's comparatively, he's narrated fewer hadith than most of the companions. But the ahadith that he did narrate are so critical to the transformation of Islamic civilization, right? It should be a course taught in Darul Ulum. But I just want to give you one philosophy of human resource management. Remember, more than people's wealth, more than people's money, more than people's homes, and more than people's businesses, we are dealing with human beings. And if we know how to effectively manage human beings, it's called emotional quotient. How to deal with people. Okay? Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu narrates this hadith. He said, the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and Abi Bakr qala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, alaykum bis-sidq, فَإِنَّهُمْ مَعَ الْبِرِّ وَهُمَا فِي الْجَنَّةِ. He said, the Prophet of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, he said, you must be truthful, for it is alongside righteousness. And they, sidq and righteousness, bir, are in paradise. So you can't be on one side, right, a 5-time namazi, performing 5 times salah in the masjid, right? But at the same time, that is bir, righteousness, but you are not truthful.
So you're a pious worshipper in the masjid and you're a cutthroat capitalist on the outside. And inside the masjid you may be astaghfirullah, and outside the masjid you will be a glib tongue liar. So he said these two, righteousness, your righteousness is only measured by the degree of truthfulness that you have in you. Okay? First, human resource management. He said, beware of falsehood. And he said, the Holy Prophet ﷺ, he said, beware of falsehood, for it is alongside wickedness, and they are both in the hellfire. Then he said, وَسَلُوا اللَّهَ الْمُعَافَى, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for wellness. So if you want to effectively manage people, then you've got to work towards the spiritual, emotional, physical, mental well-being of people. And that's what the human resource manager is. You work towards the spiritual, emotional, physical, right, and intellectual and financial well-being. So this is what a human resource manager is. Then the Holy Prophet ﷺ gave the other example. Look at these things, man. You know, it's a course on its own. The Holy Prophet ﷺ was there is nothing better if you be given yaqeen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Second to yaqeen is mu'afa. Well-being, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, etc. Then the Holy Prophet ﷺ went on to teach us how to work, particularly in terms of these issues of human tendencies, human frailties, human idiosyncrasies, and how to balance it out effectively so that we don't incline towards evil and we incline towards right. The Holy Prophet ﷺ said, وَلَا تَحَاسَدُوا, and do not envy each other. And you'll see it. Among the richest of people, if someone is richer than him, he'll envy him for his money. Oh, what, man? وَلَا تَحَاسَدُوا. You do not wish good for the other. In fact, you wish that you had it and others didn't have it. That's what envy is. You wish that the ni'mah and the blessing was taken away from you, from him, and was granted to you exclusively at the exclusion of him. This is only human resources I'm discussing right now. Human resources. Right? وَلَا تَبَاغَضُوا, and do not hate each other. Do not create dissension and disunity with each other. Do not have ill feelings towards one another. Right? Do not allow your relationships with one another to become toxic. Okay? Then he went on, and do not cut each other off. وَلَا تَدَابَرُوا. Do not cut each other off. And this is what we do. We ostracize people. Right? We want to cut people off. Right? We throw people, like I was saying, under the bus. But who does it ultimately benefit? As long as it benefits us only. وَلَا تَدَابَرُوا. And the Holy Prophet ﷺ, وَكُونُوا عِبَادَ اللَّهِ, and do not turn away from each other. وَلَا تَخَاطَعُوا وَلَا تَدَابَرُوا. The first one is وَلَا تَخَاطَعُوا, do not cut each other. وَلَا تَدَابَرُوا, and do not turn away from each other. This is one of the biggest issues. Right? One financial deal goes off, right, and we just turn away from each other and we turn against one another. Then, human resource management. Now let me give you a practical example of this as practiced by the CEO of Islam. Remember, if the Prophet of Allah is the chairman of Islam, the eternal chairman of Islam, then the eternal CEO and CFO and CEO of Islam is Abu Bakr Siddiq, because he is the friend in the cave and he is the friend in the grave. Allahu Akbar. He's the friend in the cave, fil ghar, yar fil ghar, wa yar fil mazar. And he's the friend in the grave of the Holy Prophet radiallahu ta'ala anhu. Okay? Now let me give you a practical example of Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq's human resource management. This is a narration which is narrated in Tariq Dimashq. Okay? And some of our scholars embellish it on, quite a bit on YouTube, because, if you do Mu'chi Masala, it gets interesting. Now, it goes like this here, that Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu used to have a tendency that he used to tend, and he was committed to an old, disabled woman in Al-Madinatul Munawwarah, who used to live on the outskirts of Medina, so to get to her would become problematic. Who is this? Umar ibn Khattab. Sometimes the scholars mix up the story, but anyway, this is for your information so that you get the right news. This is from Tariq Dimashq. Right? What he would do is that at night he would go to her home, he would draw water for her from the well because she can't see, she's disabled. He would draw water. Umar ibn Khattab would draw water for her, right? And he would manage her affairs, clean up and neaten up for her wherever he could. Right? However, when he started coming to her from time to time to tend to these affairs, or whether it's the water, or whether he's tending to her affairs at home and so on, he would see that somebody had preceded him to this task. Somebody had preceded him to this task. So he began to wonder, I'm doing this in the darkness of the night. this is the outskirts of Medina, right? Who's been watching me that he has preceded me, he's beat me to it, he's done the job of taking out the water from the well, tending to the affairs and so on inside the home. So he hid one night and he came a little early. And what did he see? He said he found it was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala. Now what's the interesting part? At that time, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu was who? He was the Khalif of the time. He was Amir al-Mu'mineen. He was the highest ranking political leader of the time. In charge of Baytul Mal, the national treasury. He's the general of the Muslim army. Supreme general of the Muslim army. He is the leader of the Muslim world. But he did not forget his basic human resource management requirements, that I am responsible for every citizen. And a poor old disabled woman, I have a responsibility towards her that I cannot forget. That if I'm remiss in my responsibility of amana, that I have been placed in as a political leader, and for not being able to fulfill her basic social needs, that I am remiss in my responsibility. Wow. How's that for HR? How's that for HR? And it's critically important that we understand that when it comes to these positions, of C-level positions, if we can't manage people's difficulties and problems and find effective solutions to it, then we are not fit to be in that position there of a chief operating officer. Okay? And this is now on a national level. And to a certain degree, say Abu Bakr Siddiq condition, on an international level. Taking to a second level, saying Abu Bakr Siddiq who is regarded as the CFO, the first CFO of the Islamic Empire. He himself is a wealthy man. He's a wealthy man. Right? In terms of all the categories of leadership I gave you, whether it's political, whether it is religious and spiritual, whether it was academic, whether it was or intellectual, whether it was financial, or whether it was social, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq qualifies to the highest degree in all of them. But as the chief financial officer, right, discharged with the responsibility of generating wealth and growing the Islamic Empire, nobody did the job the way Abu Bakr as-Siddiq did. And the first thing that he did, in a position of sidq, and in the position of chief financial officer, was he put his money where his mouth is. Important lesson. If there was a loss to be taken, he'd carry the loss, but he'd make sure that the people that he was discharged in terms of amana, he would fulfill their responsibility. So he'll take a knock, it's fine. That's no problem. But the people that are under me, who rely on me, that have been placed in a position of being an overseer to these things here, he says, they mustn't suffer. And in terms of human resource management, in the early days of Makkah al-Mukarramah, Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq who realized that in order for Islam to be most effective and Islam to be most prosperous, you have to balance the material and the spiritual. And he did that by example. Do you know, plus minus about 8, right, prominent slaves were freed by Abu Bakr as-Siddiq because he realized that these people won't be able to effectively practice their deen if they are still enslaved by the kuffar. Right? So in order for them to develop and maximize their potential on every level, he realized that he needed to engage in what we would call being an economic freedom fighter, or for short, EFF. Malema should learn a couple of lessons. It is narrated that he used to free the most famous being Bilal ibn Rabah, Bilal Habashi radiallahu anhu, Ammar bin Yasir, right? He freed them for a minimum of 40,000 dinars each. Now 40 dinar is a gold coin. So even if I were to say conservatively, 500,000 rand, conservatively 500,000 rand, you work it out. Conservatively, right? He wouldn't spare an expense to be able to engage in a position wherein people would find that economic, and they would be safe from any form of economic, or for that matter, physical slavery. Right? And he realized that people and the Muslim Ummah can never ever truly be free until they acquire economic freedom. Therefore, when he was appointed as the Khalif, the first war he engaged in is what is known as the famous Ridda Wars, right? Against the apostates who refused to pay the taxes. Because he realized the Islamic State, as a statesman, the Islamic State will not be able to effectively function until there are sound economic principles. and the sound economic principles are not applied, not only in theory, but not applied, in spite of the fact that they have the numbers, or they may have the military power, or they may have the spiritual influence. At one point or the other, a balanced Islamic society is as dependent on its economic sustainability as anything else. So he engaged more. Basically, SARS, he went out, South Africa, he went to revenue service, he went out there and he held everybody accountable for non-payment of tax. Pay your tax. Chief Financial Officer. And how did he do it? He realized he invested in people and he invested in community. The man who has the largest and the greatest economic portfolio, financial portfolio, or what we call a property portfolio in Islam, is Abu Bakr Siddiq. Because the land upon which Masjid al-Nabawi is built was purchased, even as what you would call it, as an honorary amount, by Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And he realized that Islam would not be able to be an effective political and social powerhouse until it did not have a center, what we call a parliament. And he established it with the building of Masjid al-Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet of Allah instructed him to pay Sahal and Suhail, who were two orphans, for the property that they owned. And Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu purchased that property. So the most precious piece of property in terms of value, purchased property, is owned by Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu. When it came to wars, the amount of money that he put in terms of securing the Muslim Ummah, right, on a military level is known to everybody. Is known to everybody. Nobody could top him in terms of those things. Why? Because he realized that as a financial officer of Islam, he needed to budget for education, he needed to budget for people's development, he needed to budget in terms of military spending. Like you have a budget. This is what he did. Because we can't categorize them, or we couldn't categorize them before, if we understand it in terms of sound economic principles and sound principles in terms of business corporations and so on, then you will see the management and leadership skills of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu himself. And I'm just giving you the tip of the iceberg. And then CEO. Yeah. I just want to read one aspect for you, right? And the Holy Prophet ﷺ said himself, as the chairman of Darul Islam, the Holy Prophet ﷺ speaking about the financial contribution as an ummati towards Darul Islam, the Holy Prophet ﷺ said, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما نفعني مال قط ما نفعني مال أبي بكر. Right? The Holy Prophet ﷺ said, the wealth of no one has benefited me personally as the chairman. Right? As the wealth of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu. When Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu heard this, he said, فَبَكَى أَبُو بَكْرَ وَقَالَ هَلْ أَنَا وَمَالِي إِلَّا لَكَ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. When he heard this, that the Prophet of Allah has made this proclamation that nobody has served Islam, particularly in terms of economic development and economic freedom, like Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala who has done. Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala who wept, and he said, Ya Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Ana wa mali illa laka ya Rasulullah. He said, Hal ana wa mali wa illa laka ya Rasulullah. Is not my wealth, and am I not only for you, ya Rasulullah? Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. In terms of the position of CEO, whether he was the political CEO, whether he was the Minister of Finance, or whether he was the Supreme General of the Commander-in-Chief of the Muslim Army, when he is appointed as that CEO of Islam, after the chairman, the Holy Prophet Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. This is in Sirah ibn Hisham. Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala who said, he says, فَحَمِدَ اللَّهُ وَأَثْنَى عَلَيْهِ بِالَّذِي هُوَ أَهْلُهُ ثُمَّ قَالَ أَمَّا بَعْدْ أَيُّهَا النَّاسِ فَإِنِّي قَدْ وُلِّيتُ عَلَيْكُمْ وَلَسْتُ بِخَيْرِكُمْ. He said, firstly, O people, I have been put in authority over you, and I am not the best of you. He acknowledged his shortcomings first. And you ask anybody, what are the secrets of a top CEO? He's not always the most intelligent of the people around, but he's intelligent enough to employ the best people around him. So this is what he's telling you over here. He said, I've been appointed to a position of authority, but I'm not necessarily the best amongst you. Therefore, he would consult with his consultative assembly of Umar ibn Khattab and Usman ibn Ghani, Ali ibn Murtada, Karamullah ta'ala wajhul kareem. He said, فَإِنْ أَحْسَنْتُ فَأَعِنُونِي. He said, if I do the right thing, then help me, support me. I hope people in positions of amana are listening. If I do the right thing, help me and support me. He said, وَإِنْ أَسَأْتُمُونِي فَقَوِّمُونِ الصِّدْقِ. He says, and if I do the wrong, then correct me. Right? He said, الصِّدْقُ أَمَانَ فَقَوِّمُونِ الصِّدْقُ أَمَانَ وَالْكِذْبُ خِيَانَةٌ. He said, truthfulness is a sacred trust, and lying is a betrayal. If you only spoke the truth. Truthfulness is a sacred trust, and give is a khiyana, is a betrayal. Then he says, وَالضَّعِيفُ فِيكُمْ قَوْلِي عِنْدِي حَتَّى أُرِيحَ عَلَيْهِ حَقَّهُ. Allahu Akbar. In terms of our recent scandals, listen to this. He said, the weak amongst you is strong in my sight. I will surely try to remove their pain and suffering. And the strong amongst you is weak to me if Allah will fulfill the rights in full. Meaning, they will be the strongest and I will take care of the weakest amongst you until I fulfill their rights. And the strongest amongst you I will bring down in order to secure the rights of the weakest amongst you in truth and in justice. And then he said, and then he gave the reason why the decline of Muslim civilization will be. He says, عندي حتى أخذ الحق منهم إن شاء الله لا يدع قوم الجهاد في سبيل الله إلا ضربهم الله بالظلم ولا تشيع الفاحشة في قوم قط إلا عمهم الله بالبلاء. He says, when obscene things spread among any nation, calamities continue to descend upon them. And he said, as long as I obey Allah and His Rasul, you should obey me. If I do not obey Allah and His Messenger, then obedience to me is not an obligation upon you. Not an obligation upon you. So as long as people are in positions of amana and trust, and they fulfill the requirements of sidq, C-level jobs, you support them, you help them, and you work towards them in right. And when they move away and deviate from the Quranic principles of justice, equality, and human resources and taking care of the needs of the weakest amongst us, then you do not support them in that. And this is the inaugural address that Abu Bakr Siddiq gave as the CEO. These are just basic lessons in terms of political leadership, spiritual leadership, financial, intellectual, social leadership of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. This type of management lessons and leadership lessons need to be implemented and taught. As not only course levels, taught in Darul Ulums, but it has to be implemented in terms of our policies, corporate ethics and morality policies that we issue in terms of what we would call our social corporate responsibilities. And this is where the Ummah needs to go. All the flowery stories are all on one side. There, you have practical management and leadership skills, right? And practical, there's it here. Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. Then you'll find sidq. Then you can go to al-amin. That's the only process of Allah grants to begin dying. Oh yes, just one more thing. It's good. I'm to mention this as an example. In terms of sidq and amana, you can see how far we have come in terms of fiduciary and responsibility and so on. That in an Islamic organization like SANZA, we've appointed 2 ladies to take on the position of a CEO and a CFO. And that is something for us to learn from. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless them, and may Allah continue to inspire us to be people judicious in nature and to fulfill the trusts by fulfilling the requirements and learning the requirements of sidq in positions of whether it's a CEO or a CFO or a CEO. And the case study for us is undoubtedly to be found amongst the greatest amongst the Siddiqeen, which Abu Bakr Siddiq.